it's really important to find, even if you have to go across the other side of the country, to find people who are psychologically supportive.
Yeah. I want to thank you for sharing such a personal story with us, because it must be difficult to talk about this, but it also is very, very educational for people to hear this.
Yeah, I mean, I find it easier now because it's about 6 years since he died. But I mean, it was the grief at the time really was because he was so young. He was only 23. It was really, really devastating, because even though we weren't partners anymore, you know, you can still love someone without wanting to be their life partner, and that was very devastating. You know, it's almost impossible to get. We found it almost impossible to get adequate, ordinary medical attention for ordinary things from the medical orthodoxy once they found out about his diagnosis. It was almost impossible.
Of course.
And in fact, I think many people just disengage. And especially one of the most toxic things to do is to keep going back for viral load testing and CD4 counts. There's one way they're really misleading, is that CD4 counts are given in cubic millimeters, and viral load tests are given in milliliters. Now, a milliliter is 1,000 times bigger than a cubic millimeter. So, supposing someone, say, has got a CD4 count of, let's say, 300 and a viral load test of, say, 100,000, it sounds psychologically as though the viral load or the virus is overwhelming your CD4s. That's the kind of image that's created in people's heads, that the virus is swarming around your CD4s and outnumbering them. But the reality is that no viral load test has ever been correlated with actual HIV anyway, and the tests themselves even admit that they cannot be used to even confirm the presence of HIV, regardless of what number you get. So what the doctors are doing is essentially measuring the finer shades of grey, whereas the test itself says it can't even tell you if the answer is black or white. But regardless of that, the psychological effect of those two numbers is quite powerful. So even if you think CD4 counts and viral load tests do have some useful value, you really need to multiply your CD4 count by 1,000 to make it comparable to the viral load number.
Right.
So that would mean comparing a CD4 count of 300,000 compared to, let's say, a viral load of 100,000. If you're going to compare like with like, that is measuring the same volume of blood that the sample's taken from. So that's kind of psychological sleight of hand, and that's the kind of thing that's used to persuade you eventually to start taking drugs.
Okay. Mike, you had a story you wanted to, actually an analogy that you wanted to bring to bear regarding the Australian Aboriginal situation and the AIDS situation.
Yes. Now, what's interesting about this is that one thing that's become quite clear is that the HIV tests are very, very heavily biased against black people or people with African genes. Now, if you look at numerous studies done in America, whichever way you cut it, black people or people classified as black are always much more likely to be diagnosed HIV positive. If you look at blood donors, for example, who are normally selected specifically because of their low-risk behaviors, black blood donors are 14 times more likely than white blood donors to be diagnosed HIV positive. Now, that's a massive ratio, particularly when blood donors are particularly selected for their low-risk behaviors. Now, if you look at pregnant women, black pregnant women are 12 times as likely to be diagnosed HIV positive as white pregnant women. And I think that was a study of around 14 million pregnant women. So that's a non-trivial study. Now, we know that in America it appears that in practice the one-drop rule still seems to apply to a certain extent. Are you familiar with the one-drop rule?
I'm not, no.
Okay, well, essentially what that meant was that anyone that had one drop of black blood was classified as black. So you've got people like Colin Powell, for example, who are classified as black, even though, you really have to wonder how much black he had in him. But what this means is that people classified as black in America, in practice, that includes a fairly substantial number of people that are mixed race to some degree, and even fairly substantially mixed race. So if you've got these massively higher rates of HIV diagnoses of people classified as black who are themselves include a fair degree of white blood, if you like, then that really underestimates the effect of African genes on the likelihood of an HIV positive diagnosis. Now, when we look at the reasons why that is, it's because essentially black people have a much higher level of antibodies anyway and a stronger antibody level response. Now, this is understandable because it's been discovered that people with a higher level of antibodies seem to have greater resistance to parasites. Now, parasitic infections seem to be much more prevalent in hotter environments, such as Africa. Now, I've had a quick look. I haven't managed to find out if Australian Aboriginals have higher levels of antibodies or not, but it's quite possible, being so dark-skinned, that if they were, say, more attuned to living in a much hotter environment, then where, let's say, parasites are more likely to be prevalent as well, then it's likely that Aboriginals will have a stronger antibody response to general antigens. If that's the case, then it's also highly likely that they will produce a much higher rate of HIV diagnoses just for being very dark-skinned, essentially.
Something I may check on myself later on.
Yeah, so it wouldn't surprise me if Aboriginals have a much higher rate of diagnoses just for being Aboriginal, essentially, that's not related to any alleged risky behaviour. So essentially, in a very, very real sense, HIV tests themselves are racist. Now, that's also not taking into account, say, environmental or economic factors of living in places like Africa. If you've got people like you've got people like Charles Geschecter, who's head of African studies at the University of California, and he said that by the African definition of AIDS, which is the Bangui presumptive definition, by the African definition of AIDS, he has AIDS nearly every time he goes to Africa. But because he's a relatively wealthy white American, he can just get on a plane and go back to America, and all of a sudden he doesn't have AIDS. But that option is not available to, of course, people that are stuck in Africa and are living in poverty, with dirty water, malnourished, and an environment that's loaded with endemic diseases. Now, you've got these bizarre, devastating misuse of funds, really, where, such as the Rakai district of Uganda, where a friend of mine was visiting recently, which is extremely poor. Now, they've recently built a brand new clinic specifically for circumcising men on the basis of faulty research that claims to show that circumcision reduces HIV infections. But the problem is that outside the clinic, people are still drinking polluted water. And now, I've forgotten his name, but there was a guy from the World Health Organization who recently told a friend of mine, or admitted to a friend of mine, that bacterial infections themselves can cause HIV positive diagnoses. So what is the point of circumcising men, which itself can cause problems and have some devastating side effects, when you're still letting people drink filthy polluted water? It really doesn't make any sense. But unfortunately, it gives some people very good careers.
Many people.
Many people, yes, a huge number of people, and of course they don't really want the gravy train to stop. So that, of course, there are huge political problems in overturning this.